and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton, with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of June 4th, 2026. We are coming to you again from the Semi-Quincentennial Division here at the Georgia Historical Society, commemorating the 250th anniversary of the United States. My special guest this week is historian John Garrison Marks, here to talk about his new book on George Washington, slavery, and American memory. John Marks is a historian and writer who explores history, museums, and the ways Americans engage with the past. He holds a bachelor's degree from Lynchburg College and a PhD in history from Rice University. His writing has appeared, among other places, in the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and Smithsonian Magazine. John also serves as a senior staff member for the American Association for State and Local History, where he leads research, leadership development, and special projects, including 9 years of thinking, writing, and speaking about the U.S. semi-quincentennial. He is the author or editor of 3 books, including Black Freedom in the Age of Slavery, Race, Status, and Identity in the Urban Americas, published in 2020 by the University of South Carolina Press. His latest book, and the one that he is here to talk about with me today, is entitled Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory, published by the University of North Carolina Press on April 17th of this year. It explores how generations of Americans have thought and fought about slavery's place in George Washington's legacy over the past 250 years. My conversation with John Garrison Marks begins now. John Marks, welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You have written a new book about George Washington and his legacy of slavery. And the title, which it took me a minute to get, was Thy Will Be Done, which is, of course, goes to the heart of what this book is all about. So I'm gonna tee this up for you and let you talk about it. As we approach the US 250, we're right in the middle of it. We're approaching our semi-quincentennial on July 4th of this year. You have written a very thought-provoking book, and for some people, I'm sure, a very disturbing book about George Washington's relationship to slavery. Can you give us a thumbnail sketch first about what his relationship to slavery was in his own lifetime?
Sure. So, despite what many people might try to tell you, George Washington's involvement with slavery was really complicated. He was actively involved in slavery for the entirety of his adult life. He bought and sold human beings as property. He exploited their labor for his own personal wealth, which was extraordinary. He's one of the wealthiest people in America. And he punished people. He sold them to the Caribbean as punishment. He actively and intimately involved himself in all of the horrors of the institution of slavery. And yet, at the same time, throughout the last couple decades of his life, he regularly expressed how uneasy he felt with his own involvement in slavery. Always in private correspondence, never actually publicly in his role as president, he would write to people and talk about how he was opposed to buying and selling human beings as you would cattle in the market, he said. He expressed his opposition to separating enslaved families, which happened all the time under the institution of slavery. And he even wrote about how he hoped there would be some plan developed to abolish slavery in the United States. He saw northern laws that were gradually abolishing the institution, and he would write to friends and to colleagues and associates and say he hoped that those kinds of laws would spread to the Chesapeake, that they would spread further south to places like South Carolina, and that there would eventually be some kind of plan for ending slavery in the United States. In 1786, he writes a letter to fellow revolutionary Robert Morris, and this is one of the most quoted lines from Washington, but he says, "There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." And so he has this really complex and contradictory relationship with the institution. And it would be really simple if this was kind of a simple redemption story, right? If he was born into a world in which enslaving people of African descent was the norm, he leads this war founded on the principles of liberty and equality, comes to see the error of his ways and gradually begins to express this opposition to slavery before, in his last will and testament, freeing all of the 123 people that he enslaved and owned outright. But unfortunately, history almost never works like that, and that story is far, far too simple. In reality, he held both of these things at the same time. He was actively involved in slavery. He was expressing this really dim view of the capacities of people of African descent to understand directions, to work, to let alone participate in American democracy, at the very same time that he was expressing this broader opposition to the institution of slavery. And I think the place that we see this happen most clearly is while he is serving as president in Philadelphia. So when George Washington becomes president, Philadelphia is the nation's capital. He takes up residence there and brings 9 enslaved people with him. But he comes to learn that Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law of 1780 had a clause that said any enslaved person who lived in the state for at least 6 months would be eligible to claim their freedom. Washington learns, as many future presidents would learn, that the law would also apply to him. And he was incensed that he would be potentially deprived of this enslaved labor while serving as president. And so he secretly writes to his personal secretary and to his wife, and he develops this scheme whereby the people he enslaved in Philadelphia would be rotated out of the state, either to Virginia or across the river to New Jersey for a couple days before they reach that 6 month point. So it would kind of reset their clock. So at the very same moment, Washington is writing pretty regularly in the 1780s and 1790s about his support for gradual abolition laws and how he thinks they're a great idea and they should spread all over the country. And yet he's so familiar with those laws because he spent so much time and effort actively undermining the Pennsylvania gradual abolition law to make sure that it didn't apply to the people that he personally enslaved. And for me, that really speaks to this contradiction that is at the very center of Washington's involvement with slavery.
You are a public historian. Like me, you're academically trained, but you work in public history. And I think you identify primarily as a public historian and everything that that means. So I want to take a second with that great setup. You started out with the idea that Washington was fully involved in slavery. This wasn't a sideline, as we often hear when you talk to the public, and particularly a white public. Let's be honest here. You get the idea that they, and you talk about this in your book, and we'll get to this part, that throughout our last 250 years, white people are the ones who are traditionally very uncomfortable having this conversation, talking about the founders and slavery, or minimizing the importance of it in their life. And so when people hear you, I wonder if they hear, oh my goodness, here's John, and he's attacking our founder because he's talking about slavery. And as I always point out to people, I'm not the one who made George Washington own slaves. That's a decision he made, as you said, fully participated for 50 years of his life at least. And it behooves us to try to understand that. How do you tackle that issue? Because I know you've had to do it. I know you've done it eloquently and very well. You do it in this book. You talk about why it's important that we not sideline this issue, but we hit it head on, and that you're not trying to attack him. You don't hate America, all those things that we hear from a public that sometimes has a very minimal appetite for this subject. So I want to get this right out here.
Yeah, I get questions like this a lot and more than I would have guessed. And I always try to explain to people that I came into this project not as a presidential historian or a historian of politics or the American Revolution. My training and my background is in mostly in the history of slavery and the history of 19th century America. And so I came into it without really any sense of without a sense that I owed anything to Washington. I didn't have strong feelings about Washington when I started the project, the way that I know a lot of people do. And so I was able to try to go into it with an open mind and like a good historian, to let the evidence show me where to go. And I first started researching the history of the people Washington enslaved and then freed from slavery and what happened to them. And as I was researching their backgrounds, I started seeing all of this conversation about Washington and about his will from abolitionists, from pro-slavery advocates, from people who were alive at the same time as Washington. Started digging back further and to really understand what the extent of Washington's involvement in slavery was, how he talked about it, how others talked about it. And I really tried to present that for the reader, that challenge, that contradiction in ways that I thought were fair and that were really grounded in the evidence. And the reality is that it is contradictory. And if you come into this conversation or you come into this book with strong feelings about Washington, then you might like some parts of it and you might not like other parts of it. But I think it's really important as Americans, if we are going to really truly understand the nature of our past, we need to explore all of it. And that means exploring both the good parts, the emancipation, and it also means exploring the realities of the reality of slavery in the American past. And I think part of what makes this so difficult for people is that more than any other figure in American history, I think, people really struggle to see George Washington as a human being, as a historical figure for so long, from really while Washington was still alive, certainly very quickly after he dies, all the way up to the present. Washington functions as this symbol of America for people. And so, discussion of Washington, criticism of Washington, digging into Washington's history can often feel like an attack on America itself. And that makes it really difficult for people. But if we are to be honest and truthful about our exploration of our history, then we need to engage with all of this stuff.
And anyone paying attention to modern political and cultural discussions knows that history is in the front lines of our political conflicts. I won't say wars, I'll use the word conflicts. How it's portrayed in public places. What are we teaching our children? What are we saying? What are we putting in museums? You make it clear that that's not a new phenomenon. That's not something that just started 10 years ago or last year. This is something that's been going on almost from the day Washington died. People have been arguing about, is his primary legacy that of slaveholder, and therefore that's what defines him. He owned other human beings, and nothing else he did redeems him from that. Or, as you put it so eloquently at the end of your book, he changed. He changed his mind, he changed his ideas, and that is the thing we should focus on. We've been having that discussion and in some ways that fight for 200 years, have we not?
Yeah, and that was really what I found most fascinating about the book. Like this isn't the book that I thought I was going to be writing when I first started doing the research, and it just became so clear how much we have been having this conversation in some form for nearly 250 years. So over the last, certainly over the last 6 years, maybe the last 10 years, since the conversation around Confederate monuments really took off in the mid 2010s, I think for a lot of people, the controversies around how we talk about the history of slavery, how we should understand the founders and other historical figures' involvement in it, has felt really controversial and has felt unprecedented. The passion and the vitriol and the ways that this conversation keeps coming around in our political discourse, I think has felt really unsettling for a lot of people. But I really came to see very quickly as I started looking into how other Americans have talked about Washington and slavery in the past, that the conversation has rarely shifted. We have been having mostly the same conversation on mostly the same terms for the better part of 2 centuries. And it is because Washington functions as this symbol of America. So anytime there are conversations about racial injustice or about patriotism or about who is an American, they come to focus on Washington in particular. He becomes this stand-in for the broader conversation. And so there are some Americans, historically mostly white Americans, who want to lift Washington up as this paragon of virtue, as the perfect American, as the foundingist father, and use his example to inspire patriotism, to inspire citizenship in other people. But always at the very same time, there are other Americans who say, if we're going to talk about the nature of American society, if we're going to talk about who counts as an American, then we need to focus on Washington's involvement in slavery. And so you see abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates talking about this in the 19th century. You see early civil rights activists talking about this during Jim Crow, around the time of George Washington's 200th birthday in the 1930s. You see it in the fight over textbooks in the 1960s about what gets included and what doesn't. And certainly you've seen it in the conflicts over history in the 1990s all the way up through today. And it's really fascinating. Like some of the most radical criticisms of Washington are happening in the 18th and 19th centuries. Things that if you said them today, people would get very, very mad at you for how critical you were being of Washington, and this was happening in the 1840s, the 1850s, while there were still people for whom Washington was in living memory.
And as we know, the part of the controversy going on as we speak is at the site of what was Washington's residence in Philadelphia while he was president, and the public exhibit there about slavery and about
Mhm.
the institution of slavery, whether to leave that there or take it down, etc. We'll get to that. So tell the story of his will, which is at the heart of your book, and for many people is the moment at which because a lot of people have some vague notion that this happened out in the public world without really understanding what this was all about. If you can, give us a snapshot of the story of George Washington's will.
Sure. And I love talking about it because I was in graduate school. I was getting my PhD in history when I first learned about this and the details around it. And it always struck me as something that should be a bigger part of the conversation about Washington. So Washington, when in 1799, in the summer of 1799, he compiles a list of all of the people that were enslaved at Mount Vernon. It was more than 300 individuals. 123 of them were owned outright by George Washington. The rest were owned effectively by Martha Washington, really by the estate of Martha Washington's first husband. Without bogging everyone down in 18th century property law here. Essentially, those enslaved people that were owned by the Custis estate, they're called the dower slaves. Washington was basically the steward of those people during his and Martha Washington's marriage and lifetime, but he didn't own them legally, and so he also couldn't free them. So he puts together this list of enslaved people in the summer of 1799, and that's also the point at which he writes his last will and testament. He dies that December, about 6 months later, and this will becomes public for the American people. And in it, Washington opens saying, I, George Washington, citizen of the United States and lately the president thereof. He really positions this as a document, I think, that he thought other people would be reading. But he quickly kind of says, all my property is going to be going to my wife, dispenses with that fairly quickly, and then spends the next few pages. It's the longest section of the will, outlining outlining for people that he would be freeing the people that he enslaved. So he says all the people that he owns in his own right would be free after he died and after Martha Washington died. What he claims in the will is that he was putting off that emancipation because there were so many ties between the dower slaves and the slaves owned by Washington that there were family connections, there were marriages, there were children, and these families would be torn apart by this emancipation event. And so he wanted to put that off for as long as he could. But once both he and Martha Washington were dead, there would be no more putting it off. And so at that point, he said that these people that he owned, 123 of them, would be freed from slavery. He was also really careful to make sure that he accounted for nearly every possible objection and possible issue that might come up. He has a couple of lines where he directs the executors of his will to make sure that this is carried out faithfully and exactly and on the timescale that he indicates, which you would think that someone like George Washington wouldn't have to put so clearly in his will, but he felt compelled to do that. He says that those who are too young when when he and his wife died would be provided for out of the funds from his estate. They should be trained in a trade. They should be taught to read and write, despite the fact that that was already illegal in under Virginia law. And there were others who were too old to take advantage of freedom in the best possible way. And Washington understood that possibility as well. And he said that those who, for whatever reason, decide that they want to remain at Mount Vernon, and thinking especially about those who were elderly, those who had some kind of physical handicap, were for some reason unable to take advantage of freedom and kind of build a life for themselves, that those people should be provided for with funds from the estate. And so when he dies in 1799, a couple weeks later, this will gets published all across the country. It's truly an American phenomenon because as soon as Washington dies, newspaper printers and pamphleteers are trying to turn a profit, reprinting Washington's will and selling it to the public. It gets republished in newspapers, sometimes the full text of it. So everyone would have known that Washington had made this decision to free the people he enslaved. But it also left Martha Washington in a somewhat uneasy position because it said it was after his death and Martha Washington's death that they would be freed from slavery. And so after Washington dies, Martha Washington comes to realize that there are 123 people that she is enslaving at Mount Vernon who recognize that her life is the only thing standing between them and freedom. And so within a couple of weeks, she says, I'm not going to make them wait until my death, afraid that one of these people would do what they could to hasten that event, shall we say. And she says they'll be free at the end of the year. So effectively, January 1st, 1801, 123 people that Washington enslaved stepped into freedom for the first time.
It's a remarkable story. And one of the most remarkable parts of your book is you do not let the story end there. You want to find out what happened to these people. What lives did they lead? And there's a remarkable quote that you have in here, and I want to get this right, where you talk about the research that you were able to do, um, and you say that these people's experiences in freedom were substantial enough that it left evidence for me to find 200 years later is incredible. You couldn't track them all down, but you did find a lot simply by looking. What did you find?
Yeah, this was really what drew me into the book the first time. This is the book that I thought I was going to write. It was about what happened to these people. It really struck me that conversation about the will and this emancipation event was always the last couple of pages of a book about Washington. And I really wanted to know what would it look like if instead of putting this story at the very end of a book about Washington, we put it at the beginning of a story about Black freedom in early 19th century Virginia. And so that is the kind of research I did in my first book, exploring the experiences of free Black people before the end of slavery. And so I had done this kind of research before, so I knew how hard it would be and what it would entail. And ultimately, what I found is that this huge cohort of people, they were one in every five free Black people in Fairfax County at the time of Washington's death. That kind of transformed the demographics and the population of the county. And some of them decided to stay at Mount Vernon for the reasons I just suggested earlier. They were too young, or they were too old, or they had spouses who were remained enslaved, and they had been deprived of education and training and the ability to earn money and the kinds of things that they could have used to build a life for themselves in freedom. And so they chose to stay at Mount Vernon as free people. But most of them struck out on their own and built lives for themselves as free people. They founded churches, they founded institutions, they developed family farms. Some of them found work in nearby Alexandria, where free Black people could engage in trades like tailoring and barbering and carpentry, and they were really able to build up lives for themselves and establish free families in this little corner of Fairfax, Virginia. But finding those stories is really where the challenge was. When you're writing a book about George Washington, the problem is that there's too much information, that you can just get overwhelmed and lost in all of the correspondence and all of the books and all of everything that people have said about him. But when you're trying to write something about the individuals that he enslaved and then freed from slavery, you have to just try to piece together just enough pieces of this puzzle that you can maybe create the outline of a life. And so that often involved looking at Washington's list of people that he enslaved, looking at the tax records from Fairfax County. Virginia had a law that said free black people needed to register their freedom at the county courthouse once every couple of years, which they sometimes did and sometimes didn't. And there was never really any enforcement of that law. But when they do, they often said how they acquired their freedom. And so there are dozens of people who say they acquired their freedom from George Washington's will, or that they had once been enslaved by General Washington. And that was really crucial because in Washington's list of enslaved people, they were just listed with first names and maybe an age. That was an estimate. In these records, these registration records, they had surnames. And then I could,
Mm.
instead of just having one idea, one name, I had a first and last name that I could check with census records and city directories and county tax records and things like that to try to understand what was happening to these people. And mostly all you're able to find is that this person lived there. They lived there for these many years. They paid taxes. They lived in a household with their son or their daughter. They owned a family farm. There's not a whole lot in detail that you can say, but I do think it's really meaningful and powerful that you can find those people at all. And I tried to make that come clear in the book. For
Hmm.
for other people, there are some really tragic circumstances when you try to understand their life and freedom. So one example I talk about in the book is that of Samuel Anderson, and he was probably, I believe, in his 50s or so when he gained his freedom in 1801. He had actually been born as a free person in West Africa. He's one of the few people enslaved at Mount Vernon who was born in West Africa, enslaved, brought over through the Middle Passage, and then enslaved in the United States. And so he was enslaved for, the better part of 40 years and finally gains his freedom through Washington's will. But he was married to a woman who was among the dower slaves. She was owned by Martha Washington, and so she did not get her freedom. And because of the nature of American slavery, that also meant that all of his children remained enslaved. And so it's this bittersweet moment that I really struggled to kind of imagine and articulate, where after 40 years of slavery, Samuel Anderson finally is a free man, and yet his wife and all of his children remain locked in this institution, and he doesn't know what is going to happen to them after Martha Washington's death. And so he works really tirelessly to try to earn money and save money as a free man that he can then use to purchase the freedom of some of his family members. So about 10 years after he gains his freedom, he purchases his youngest daughter, a girl named Charity, purchases her so that he can free her from slavery. Later, he ends up purchasing some of his grandchildren and freeing them as well. And these are enormous, enormous sums of money that he had to raise. And it is easy to see, one happening in 1811 and another happening 7 or 8 years later, and think of them as close together. But all throughout that time, seems to be working for no other reason but to save money to be able to purchase these people out of slavery. And so I was glad that I was able to find enough in researching the book that I could tell those stories, hopefully add more detail, shine a light on their experiences, and hopefully do justice to their lives in the book.
You mentioned that Martha Washington was in the unenviable position of having people basically sit around either waiting for her to die, hoping she will die, or maybe even helping that happen. But even then, she was left with, I think, about 153 individuals that she owned, plus all the ones, of course, who were rented. That adds up to the 316 people, I think, who were in that list in June.
Hmm.
So she felt no compunction to emancipate them. She did not feel as if these people were going to resent her. She didn't live that much longer, but these people remained enslaved. Do we have any idea why she didn't feel the need to do that herself? Uh, is it fair to say that she showed us exactly what she thought about her husband doing that by the fact that she refused to do it? Or is that a bridge too far? Do we know?
We don't know precisely, but there is no indication that I have found that she had any desire to free these people, that she considered freeing these people from slavery. And so it's possible that she did kind of think that her husband had made the wrong decision in freeing the people that he enslaved. Other Southern slave owners would make that case in the decades that followed, that this was a mistake and that if Washington could come back to life and take it back, he would. But it's also complicated by a couple of different factors. One is that while Washington was alive, he complained that he enslaved too many people at Mount Vernon. He enslaved almost twice as many people, he said, than he could profitably put to work. But he had also expressed this kind of moral objection to buying and selling people, which would have been the obvious way to kind of rid yourself of excess laborers, would be to sell them into the market. And he was opposed to doing that. So by the time he dies, there are many more enslaved people at Mount Vernon than are needed to run the estate. And it's a kind of a drag financially on the plantation's finances. And so Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington, he's one of the executors of his will. Within a couple of days of Washington's death, he is writing to his aunt, he's writing to Martha Washington, saying that she should rid herself of plantation cares and troubles, and says, you're better off having this 123 people freed because it means that you don't have to provide for them anymore. And so there was the fact that she was kind of afraid for her life, but it was also a financial decision. It was kind of pure accounting that
Hmm.
led her to free the people Washington emancipated in his will to free them early. The other complicating factor is that she didn't have legal ownership of these people. Because of an 18th century legal custom called coverture, they were owned by her first husband's estate. When she got married, it was her husband who had control of those people. And then when he died, they were still owned by the Custis estate and essentially were owned by the male heirs of that estate. And so there might have been a way, if she had gotten approval from those male heirs and worked with them and filed the right paperwork, that she could have freed the people that she enslaved. But it wouldn't have been as easy for Martha Washington as it would have been for George Washington.
Hmm.
All of that being said, there is no indication that she was anything but a kind of typical Southern enslaver. She had, there were people who were going to inherit this very substantial property. They had livelihoods that depended on it, and she intended to pass that on to the Custis heirs.
And it's at this point, oh, before we leave the subject of the will, you have a fascinating little discussion about that. It still exists.
Yes, it does still exist. When I was researching the chapter about what happens to the people in freed by Washington, I went to the Fairfax County Historic Records Room, where the county tax records, county census records, baptisms, things like that get stored. And when you walk into that archive, Washington's will is everywhere. It is the most important document that they have. It's on bookmarks. You can get little buttons that have pieces of Washington's will. They have free copies in a little basket. You can buy a slightly nicer copy from the archive. And I asked the archivist there, like, can I see it? I'm writing this book about, Washington's will is, if there's a main character in it, it's Washington's will. I'd like to see it. And she was like, no, we don't keep it here in the archive because too many employees have access to it. And
Mm.
so we keep it in the criminal evidence vault that is kind of across the way in this county judicial complex. And so she said that like even they, as archivists, they have to get, special permission and they have to go with people, the few people who have access to this, this evidence locker, basically, this vault to open it up. And she said, I did not put this in the book, but she said, when you open the door to that vault to get the will because they're putting it on display somewhere or they're loaning a page out, she said that the marijuana smell that comes out of this evidence vault when you go to get Washington's will is overwhelming. And so I never did get permission to go along with them into the vault, but she painted a pretty good picture for me.
So you never actually saw the real thing.
I did not. There was a
Yeah.
page that was on display at Mount Vernon. They often have a page or two of the will on
Hmm.
display, but I never got to see the actual thing. But because it's George Washington, it has long been digitized with these
Hmm.
really high resolution images that you can flip through, and I could do it from my basement or from my office,
Hmm.
and look at every pen stroke. I could see that he forgot to sign the bottom of one of the pages. All of that stuff was available digitally, but I never did get my chance to see the document in person.
After you tell this story, the heart of your book is really is the subtitle of your book, The Legacy of Slavery, Washington's Legacy of Slavery. A lot of people, and I'm sure you've encountered this as a public historian, do not understand how historians interpret the past. They always say, well, just give us the facts. Aren't the facts that Washington freed his slaves? And what you're doing over the rest of the book is for 200 years, how Washington's legacy has been used or interpreted, not by historians, really, but by everyday Americans who suited it to their purposes. As we know, in the years after the Revolution, slavery sort of came under attack, if you will, by those who had lived through the Revolution, who thought there would be a gradual process where slavery, even in places like South Carolina and Georgia, would end. But we know that as the Republic spread westward and lands were opened up for especially short staple cotton production, slavery actually, and of course things like the Haitian Revolution, which scared the life out of a lot of white Americans in the 1790s, slavery became more fastened upon American life. And in fact, people no longer saw it as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. How did that affect the way Washington's legacy was interpreted all the way up through? That's a way of setting up. Take us through the beginning of the Civil War. How did Americans have these candid conversations at that time?
Yeah, I think it's so important to recognize how much slavery changes and how much the conversation around slavery changes over the course of the first 75 years of
Mm-hmm.
American history. I think for a lot of Americans, slavery is always kind of 1850s Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
It's this image of huge plantations and picking cotton and overseers kind of looming over enslaved people. But that wasn't the slavery of the late 18th century Chesapeake. That wasn't the world that George Washington inhabited and many of the other founders inhabited. And so Washington, expressed this uneasiness with his involvement in the institution and then frees them in his will. And other enslavers in that era did too. They recognized the hypocrisy of leading this revolution and also enslaving other people. But as you say, by the time you get to the 1820s and kind of a generation removed from the revolution, that's gone. And most white Southerners, most Southern enslavers view slavery as you said, a positive good, as something that is not only good for Southern society, it's good for enslaved people themselves. But you have this huge conflict over the future of slavery in the United States. You have Northern anti-slavery advocates, increasingly radical abolitionists who are demanding an end to the institution in various ways. And you have pro-slavery Southerners who are demanding that the institution not only continue, but spread to the American West. They're worried about getting locked in on an island, so to speak, if it isn't allowed to spread as far west as possible, that they're going to end up like Haiti or some of these other Caribbean islands where you saw slave revolts. And so both anti-slavery and pro-slavery Americans invoke Washington to try to serve their purposes. So pro-slavery, or I should start with anti-slavery Americans are citing Washington's history in a couple of different ways. You have some who are saying Washington saw fit to free the people that he enslaved, and so what could be more American than ending slavery? And they use it to try to build up some version of the anti-slavery cause. They kind of craft this abolitionist version of Washington. More frequently, you have these really radical abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison and Parker Pillsbury, who are using withering criticism of George Washington to make the case that slavery is woven into the very foundations of the United States and only radical action could possibly root it out. So they are reminding their audiences in speeches and in writing that George Washington lived and died a slaveholder, or that George Washington was a slaveholder to the day of his death. At one point in the 1850s, the abolitionist Parker Pillsbury tells a crowd that if Washington should come back to earth and become a slaveholder once again. I would declare him a traitor to the cause of freedom. And like I said earlier, if you called George Washington a traitor to the cause of freedom today in a speech, that it would not sit well with a huge number of Americans. And so it is important to recognize just how radical this rhetoric was. And that was why they did it, right? They wanted the slavery issue to be front and center for Americans. They wanted this conversation to happen. They thought that they had the moral and legal right on their side. And so they welcomed this controversy. And they used this criticism of Washington that they knew was going to irk people. They used that criticism of him in order to do it. But pro slavery Southerners are using Washington's example too to try to defend their position and to say that actually George Washington would support the pro slavery cause if he lived today. And so they make this case, especially as you get closer to the Civil War, that George Washington was a Southerner, George Washington was a slave owner, and George Washington fought a revolution to overthrow a tyrannical government. And so as you get into the 1860s and the secession of Southern states from the U.S., they are claiming that they are just doing what Washington would do, right? They are saying that they too are slave owners trying to overthrow and object to government tyranny. And so in 1862, for example, the Confederacy inaugurates its permanent government in Richmond, Virginia. And they do it in front of a massive statue of George Washington in downtown Richmond. And they do it on George Washington's birthday. They do it on February 22nd, 1862. And lest that symbolism go over people's heads, Confederate President Jefferson Davis said that their cause, the cause of slavery, was fitly associated with the day and the setting. If you look at the seal of the Confederate States of America, George Washington is right in the middle of it on horseback. He's on Confederate money. He's at the top of Confederate newspapers. So they are clearly making the case that George Washington, the slave owner, would have supported the Confederate cause at the very same time that anti-slavery Americans are saying that Washington absolutely would not do that. And what you see when you look at this example is all of the ways that you could craft a version of Washington to fit the political and cultural demands of a particular moment. None of these people, despite how much they are talking about history and talking about Washington, they're not doing it to help people better understand the history. They're doing it to make a point. They're doing it to try to score political points and advance their particular cause, whether that is anti-slavery or pro-slavery. And I think in this example too, you see how difficult it is for historians to only present the facts. I'm like you're exactly right that's what people say that they want, and that's sort of what many people think that historians do. But all of the people in the lead up to the Civil War who are citing Washington, they are citing facts. There's almost nothing that they say that is incorrect or is a falsehood or is just a kind of invention of their imagination. They are all things that are grounded very clearly in evidence. The anti-slavery Washington, the unrepentant enslaver, the emancipator, and the Confederate vision of Washington are all factual and truthful in some way, but they're all only partial truths. They're these distorted images of Washington based on a very selective reading of the evidence. And interpretation demands that we actually look at all of the evidence and see what we can make of it, that we absorb all of these different contradictions, all of these changes over time, and try to tell a story about that. And that demands more than just presenting the who, what, and where.
And you make clear talking about using this for ideological purposes. So after slavery comes to an end in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, and after Reconstruction is defeated, let's say by 1877, the white South and the white Americans in general now see to put quotes around it, the race question or the problem with African Americans as something best forgotten about. This becomes a problem. And the way to solve that problem is to stop talking about slavery completely. So from about 1865 all the way up through the Washington Bicentennial in 1932, you make it clear that all of these things that had been such a robust part of the conversation in the antebellum period, Washington as a freedom, as someone who granted freedom or someone who enslaved, becomes just Washington the Great American, in which slavery is almost never mentioned at all.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people to understand sometimes the ways that Americans' views of slavery were not always perfectly consistent with their views of race and their views about the place of African Americans in the nation and in a participatory democracy. And so after slavery ends, and there is this, long, decade-long commitment to reconstructing the South, to ensuring the rights of African Americans, eventually white Northerners get just as tired of the time and money and demands of that as white Southerners do. And they want to see the nation brought back together. They want to see the nation move on. And in order to kind of reforge a collective United States, at least one that is reforged for white people, they needed some kind of symbol to help them do that. And Washington is, like he always is standing right there in the wings, waiting to be used by this new generation of Americans. And so Washington becomes this symbol yet again for how to be a good American. And for many people, Washington, the slave owner, Washington's involvement with slavery just isn't useful for that project. So many white people feel like we have talked about slavery too much. We have talked about the rights of African Americans too much. This is taking too much time. This is taking too much money. We want to move on with our lives. And so instead of talking about Washington's involvement with slavery that had been so salient and been such an important part of some of the 1850s and 1860s biographies of Washington, you again get this focus on Washington, this perfect character, right? This emblem of American virtue and citizenship. And so there's this focus on Washington's piety, on Washington's hard work, on Washington's commitment to education, on his, agrarian inventiveness, and all of these elements of Washington as a person that Americans thought could be instructive for bringing the nation back together and could be the kind of person, the kind of symbol that Americans, both North and South, could agree upon. And unfortunately, a focus on the institution of slavery just didn't serve that project. And so you can almost literally see it disappearing from biographies and other histories of the United States as you go from the 1870s to the early decades of the 20th century.
Yeah, white reconciliation was more important than coming to terms with the history of slavery. And so, take us, if you will. So the next big point in your book is the bicentennial. It's 1932. We're going to celebrate the 200th anniversary of George Washington, or commemorate it. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the official commemoration almost never mentions slavery. But African Americans, particularly people like W.E.B. Du Bois, see this as a perfect opportunity to put slavery front and center, and to make everybody, quite frankly, and by everybody I mean the dominant white audience, very uncomfortable. How did this all play out?
Yeah, what's really fascinating about this George Washington bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of his birth, is that it starts to look a lot like modern commemorations. There is a lot here that people who have spent any time planning or paying attention to the 250th will recognize. So 6 years before the anniversary, Calvin Coolidge delivers this address where he says we need to honor George Washington. We need to appropriately mark this anniversary, and we're going to have a year-long commemoration, not just on one day. We're going to have it be all year long, and we're going to have it be all over the country. This is the period where there's, the World's Fair is still a big thing. You have a typical commemoration is going to have, a city built overnight. It's going to be the show of American, industrial prowess and things like that. And that's not what they did for the Washington bicentennial. They wanted it to be this grassroots, this community effort. And what is also so fascinating about it is that as Coolidge is announcing the creation of this commission to plan the George Washington bicentennial, he recognizes that the version of Washington they have received by the time you get to the late 1920s does not really feel like the real thing to them. They recognize how much mythology has been built up around Washington, how he has been quite literally cast in bronze and marble, how these stories about him have been repeated over time. And there's this kind of hesitation and this worry that, it's like Theseus's ship, right? There have been pieces of Washington taken off and replaced with more useful versions so many times over the last several decades that by the time you get to the 1920s, people are wondering, white Americans and black Americans are wondering, like, is this really the real George Washington? And so that becomes kind of the guiding principle of the Washington bicentennial, this quest to understand and reintroduce Americans to the real George Washington. And so this all-white federal commission, along with many all-white kind of state and local planning bodies, they try to produce publications, they produce teachers' courses to better train people in Washington's history. They go back to Washington's original writings. They produce atlases. They produce some of the earliest films. This is the point at which Washington gets put on the quarter. It's the point at which the highway between Washington, D.C. and Mount Vernon gets built. It's when they rename the bridge connecting North Jersey and Manhattan, the George Washington Bridge. So Washington is everywhere in American life in the lead up to this 1932 anniversary. But amid all of that, all of the products and all of the education efforts, all the publications, there is no effort at all to engage with the history of slavery. It is utterly unmentioned in in the records of the Washington Bicentennial Commission. That's thousands and thousands of pages. You can count on one hand the number of times that slavery comes up. They credit Washington with inventing ice cream, but they don't talk about Washington's involvement with slavery. But as there always are, there are other Americans who stand up and say, okay, if this anniversary is about uncovering and exposing the real George Washington, then that means we're going to talk about the institution of slavery. So you have black intellectuals and educators and scholars, prominent black newspapers who all focus really, really intently on Washington's history with slavery. And you have people like Carter G. Woodson, the founder of what's now Black History Month, writes a series of essays really exploring African Americans' contributions to the Revolution and Washington's involvement with slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois writes a pageant in which Washington is depicted as an enslaver. There's a scene in it where he is literally counting off the number of people he enslaves on the various farms that made up Mount Vernon. The Baltimore Afro-American, it's one of the most prominent black newspapers in the country. It is regularly publishing some pretty lurid headlines, saying things like George Washington slave driver, George Washington, whipped women slaves until their blood ran. These really kind of graphic depictions of Washington as enslaver. And for both groups, it is again trying to make sense of and find a version of Washington that would be useful to their current cultural and political moment. So for white Americans, especially for federal officials, they are looking at the unbelievable changes that are happening in American society in the 1920s and 1930s. Women have just gained the right to vote. There is a huge wave of immigration into American ports. It's the first time that more Americans are living in cities than are living in rural areas. And amid this kind of whirlwind of change, they're looking for an example that can show these people how to be a good American. And so they focus again on Washington and they focus on these kinds of character traits that they want people to learn from. For Black Americans, this is kind of the height of Jim Crow violence. It is the early years of the Great Migration of African Americans fleeing the South and the kind of racial intimidation and disenfranchisement that was part and parcel of the Jim Crow era. And they are focusing on Washington's involvement with slavery to make the point that racial injustice is something that is deeply rooted in American history and to try to call attention to the need to address the racial injustices of the present.
As we move forward in time and in your book, and I want to be mindful of your time, you have a whole discussion about Washington's place in American educational textbooks. And anyone who has lived through the culture wars of the last 10, 15 years can sort of understand that this goes back many, many, many decades. How best to talk about the whole idea of Washington and the other founders and their participation in slavery. And you make it clear that a lot of people then, now, today, still feel that to talk about Washington and slavery is to attack him, to besmirch him, to somehow it's unpatriotic. And I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on this other than you reinforce that this has been going on for a very long time. This didn't just start in the last 10 years.
Absolutely. It goes back, at least a century to the 1920s. You see it really clearly during the civil rights movement as scholars are learning all these new things about the history of African Americans and women and indigenous people. And some scholars are trying to get those things into textbooks. And you see this kind of fundamental disagreement about what the purpose of history class is and what the purpose of a textbook is.
Mm-hmm.
Some people think it is to inspire love of country, is to inspire patriotism, and other people think it is a tool for examining the past and better understanding how American society came to be. But what I find most fascinating in looking at these civil rights era textbooks, where you have white Americans objecting that the textbook or the classroom isn't the place to debunk our heroes, most of them don't actually mention Washington's involvement with slavery. They mention Washington in the ways that they always do, and they mention slavery too. And for some Americans, I'm not Southern enough to put this in the book, but this is the perfect place for it. There's a very like clear sign that a hit dog will holler, if I may, where just talking about Washington near where you talk about slavery to some people is too much, and it means that you're trying to criticize Washington, even when that's
Mm-hmm.
not even in the text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And all of this happened, of course, in the 1960s with the civil rights movement, bringing race again to sort of the forefront of American political and cultural life. We began to hear talk about the textbooks, but also, of course, the mention of slavery, the discussion of slavery, and how it's interpreted at public historical sites like Mount Vernon. And that is how you end the book, really, with a fantastic chapter about the ways in which it has been. And we know we've seen this too, because there's all kinds of discussion going on in popular culture about going to the site of a plantation, and for many years never even hearing who these quote servants were, the role they played. It's kind of like if you, I think I point out to people, it's like talking about Mark Zuckerberg and acting as if Facebook never existed. It's really difficult to separate those two things.
Mhm.
Um, if you can, give us a thumbnail sketch of how slavery has been interpreted at Mount Vernon over the last 60 years. That's a big, broad question, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is really fascinating, and this is the chapter that I probably put the most of myself in as a public
Mm-hmm.
historian and my own experiences with these issues. But Mount Vernon deserves a lot of credit. They were among the very first historic sites to place a marker on a cemetery that was used by enslaved people. That marker has all the language. This was in the 1920s, in 1929. That marker has all of the language of the lost cause. It is devoted to the faithful colored servants who served the Washingtons. But it was put there out of a genuine desire for historic preservation. They were worried that that spot was going to be eliminated. That was sort of the only way that slavery was marked at Mount Vernon for a very long time. By the time you get to the 1960s, 1970s, there's a sense among the Mount Vernon board that they're kind of starting to fall behind the times, and they need to keep up and need to add more about the African American experience, about the experiences of enslaved people. By the time you get to so they renovate and restore the greenhouse slave quarters, and that sits there sort of somewhat uninterpreted. But the whole rest of the site is really dedicated to celebrating George Washington. But as you get into the 1980s and 1990s, there is more of a public call to for Mount Vernon to do more of this kind of work to really put the history of slavery front and center. So they build a new memorial at the enslaved cemetery that more properly kind of memorializes the people who were enslaved and buried at Mount Vernon. And over the last 30 years, you've seen a kind of steady growth in the ways that the history of slavery is addressed at the site. It gets woven into the interpretation at things like the kitchen and in the mansion and at the spinning house and in some of these other sites. They start to tell the story of slavery publicly. They start to spend more time and money devoted to scholarship and bringing scholars of slavery to Mount Vernon to investigate these kinds of questions. And then in 2016, Mount Vernon launches a major new exhibit in which they fully explore the lives of about a dozen people enslaved by George Washington, alongside Washington's kind of evolving view of the institution. And that's really, I think, a watershed moment for the interpretation of slavery at Mount Vernon. And a big part of what made that exhibit possible was their work with descendants of slavery. And so they begin to work with people alive today whose descendants were enslaved at Mount Vernon by the Washingtons. And it's working with this group that really starts to change the interpretation. And they deserve a lot of credit for their help in putting that group together, helping connect different descendants with one another, and using that group to weigh in on these exhibits, on some of these new things that they're doing, like audio tours to tell the history of slavery. I know they have depictions of enslaved people in some of their new exhibits for the 250th anniversary. Just last year, they put part of that 2016 exhibit, gave it a permanent home in the historic area, so that that exploration of the experiences of enslaved people isn't just at the museum; it's on the historic grounds itself, and it is at a place that is connected to the history of slavery. My worry when I go to the site is that I think if you wanted to, you could still go through Mount Vernon and ignore the history of slavery. And that doesn't sit well with a lot of people. A lot of people make the case that this was a site of slavery. The vast majority of people who ever lived at Mount Vernon were enslaved people. They were not Washingtons. And so that should be the story that this site tells. But something that's become really clear in researching and writing this book and thinking about the task in front of Mount Vernon of trying to figure out how much space to give slavery and how much emphasis to give slavery is the fact that they are being asked to answer a question that Americans have been unable to settle on an answer for the better part of 250 years. The question of how much emphasis should slavery get when we talk about George Washington's legacy has been contested literally for centuries. And often people's either satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the interpretation of slavery at Mount Vernon is about how they answer that question for themselves, more so than it is about anything that Mount Vernon is doing.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned the descendants. It's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. And even when you were talking about those who were freed in 1801, you have actually talked to some of these descendants. Some of them have very interesting ideas and have been involved in the interpretation of slavery. There would the one, and I don't remember her name, but who had the idea of the silhouettes. Can you talk about that for just a second? Because that was fascinating.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate and honored that I had a chance to talk to 5 different members of the Mount Vernon descendant community. And I knew that this was a big part of public history work now, working with descendant communities, and I knew it had to be a part of my book. And so I was honored that they shared their stories with me and glad I could make them part of the book. But one woman, her name is Ann Chin, she's been involved with a lot of the work and interpretation of slavery that's happened at Mount Vernon over the last decade. And she is the kind of person that is never satisfied with how things are now. She always wants to see the institution doing more. She is pushing them to do more. And one of the ideas that she had is she wants to see silhouettes of the 316 people enslaved by the Washingtons when he died in 1799, wants to see silhouettes of them kind of created out of metal or something else and put up at Mount Vernon to give people a real kind of visual indication of how many people 300 317 is. It would help you see really clearly how many of those 300 plus people were children, right? How many of them were babies? To be able to see a number and see it written on a page is one thing. To see a kind of visual indication of it is quite another. And so I think that's a really interesting, if provocative, kind of approach to interpreting slavery there. But what I found fascinating about talking with the descendants is that there isn't perfect agreement among members of the descendant community. Some of them have this really strong attachment to Mount Vernon and are really celebratory and encouraging about how much progress has been made and how much work that they have done. Mount Vernon has probably spent more time and money researching and interpreting the history of slavery than any other historic site, I would guess. And there are some descendants who are really happy with how that work has proceeded. And then there are others who always want to see the site doing more. And I think the fact that there is disagreement even among descendants of slavery at Mount Vernon speaks to how difficult a question this is to get right. And for me, it's more important that we have these conversations and that Mount Vernon can help move those conversations along, and other museums and historic sites can bring people together to talk about what this means for us than it is on the specific answer of how they interpret it and what they decide to do.
You make it clear in your book that in the discussion of Washington, particularly as we approach the US 250, the very moment, that we need to be clear that Washington was involved heavily in the institution of slavery. And you say it's the most demeaning institution probably ever invented by humans, and that he was heavily involved in it. But we have to recognize that he changed. And it may have been late when he manumitted these enslaved people, but that he did it, and that's part of the story too. You sort of just summed it up. But as we approach July 4th of this year, and beyond that, where do you, John Marks, stand now as to George Washington's legacy? Will we ever be comfortable with this, or is this elusive? Is it the thing going all around the corner always?
Yeah, I don't think there is ever going to be an answer that feels fully satisfying to the one way we should understand George Washington's legacy and slavery's place within it. The more I've thought about it and the more I've talked about it, the more I see just how unresolvable these contradictions at the heart of Washington's legacy are. He was an unrepentant enslaver for the vast majority of his life, and yet he also takes this action at the end that most enslavers do not take in freeing the people he enslaved. And it just leaves this deeply ambiguous legacy. And I think understanding and sitting with and getting comfortable with that ambiguity is what I hope this book can help people do. And that's where I think we really need to get better as Americans, as people, as readers of history, is to sit with that ambiguity and understand that sometimes history just doesn't have all the answers that we want it to have. We really want it to be able to clearly point the way. We really want it to be able to have the lesson for us that is going to tell us the final answer. But when it comes to Washington and slavery, there just is no one way to look at this question. There is never going to be some document that we unearth. There is never going to be some masterwork of history by me or anybody else that fully settles this question once and for all and to the satisfaction of all Americans. And so I think what we have to recognize, and what we have a really unique opportunity to recognize with the 250th anniversary this summer, is that having that conversation is a really important part of this process. That the way that you decide to make sense of this history, the answer that you come to about slavery's place in George Washington's legacy, if it's informed by history and informed by evidence, and you've taken a look and thought about the kind of totality of the picture here, wherever you come down on that issue is probably justifiable in one way or another. But I also hope that it helps people recognize that their neighbor, their fellow community members, their fellow Americans might come to a different answer than they do, and that is okay too. And I think where we need to get more comfortable is leaning into that ambiguity, leaning into that contradiction, understanding all of the different ways that Washington can get used now, why people might have these different opinions on Washington's legacy, and be able to understand that in order to move forward as a society.
Can't say it any better than that. Even those who think they know Washington well will learn a great deal in your book. It's entitled Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory. It was published on April 7th of this year by the University of North Carolina Press. John Garrison Marks, thanks so much for coming on here, and best of luck in everything that you are doing going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been an honor.
My thanks to John Marks for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at uncpress.org and at his website, johngmarks.com. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Crellin. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. If you're a fan of Today in Georgia History, and who isn't, check it out at the completely redesigned website at todayingeorgiahistory.org, and you can see it and hear it, currently airing twice a day on TV and radio on Georgia Public Broadcasting. You can find this podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including Podchaser, YouTube Music, Spotify, and, of course, the podcast app on your phone. Wherever you listen or find it, please like, follow, subscribe, and share. And drop me a line at sdeaton@georgiahistory.com. Be sure and like Off the Deaton Path on Facebook as well. You can also treat yourself to every Off the Deaton Path podcast, blog, and video that I've ever created at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.